Morning. I'm Bethany from Mulberry Farm, and this podcast is about a lot of different things, all related to living on a farm and doing things yourself, growing things, baking things, creating things, caring for critters, lots of other things. And today I wanted to talk about gardening. It's the first day of spring, and gardening is one of my great lifetime joys. My dad built me a flower box when I was 8 and took me to the little hardware store in town, and we went to this tiny little greenhouse that he had in the back, and I bought some alyssum and moss roses and snapdragons, and I took them home and I planted them in my flower box, and I got a watering can and I would carry it from the house. We lived out in the country, had this big driveway. It felt like a really long ways, but I would carry this watering can all the way out there and water my flowers every day. And ever since then, I have loved plants, particularly flowers. But when we moved to Iowa about 4.5 years ago, I got my first chance for a really big vegetable garden, and I have been loving that. So I wanted to give some advice if this is your first season growing vegetables, or maybe you've been growing them for years. But I think it's helpful to go back and think about what is the priority, because most of the time, most of the people that I know struggle with gardening after that initial spring rush, and then it becomes a lot of work and gets more discouraging as the summer goes on. And so I wanted to give a few tips to help with that so that you can enjoy the gardening for the whole season and not just the fun spring part of the season. So the first piece of advice I think is probably most important for people who have never grown a vegetable garden before, and that is to grow what you like to eat. I've seen plenty of people who want to grow a garden. They go to the greenhouse and they look at all the pretty plants and they decide they're going to grow everything that everybody else grows, like tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, squash, zucchini, all of those normal things. And some of these people don't even like tomatoes. And so they go and they buy tomato plants and they plant them in their garden. And they grow beautiful tomatoes, but they don't like to eat them. And so they wind up just giving them away. Or they go to waste. And then it's a lot of work for not a lot of enjoyment, because they're not buying things that they really enjoy eating. So the first suggestion is to make sure that what you are planting in your garden this year is something that you really enjoy eating, or your family really enjoys eating. You don't need to go buy anything fancy or spectacular, especially if this is your first year. Go get eggplants or something when you don't know if you like eggplants, or you don't know if anybody in your house likes eggplants. Just don't buy it. Buy something you know that you like, you know that you're going to use, you know that you guys enjoy. The second piece of advice is to start off smaller than you want. Now, this is really, really hard for me, and it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black, because I have a huge garden. Last year it was over 4,000 square feet, and this is the voice of experience saying that that's not always a good idea. If you plant a smaller garden and you keep up with the weeds, it feels much more like an accomplishment, like you're staying on top of it, and it's a rewarding experience. You actually get more produce for a smaller amount of space. When you get into a bigger garden that you have trouble keeping up with, then your productivity per square foot goes down, while your amount of work stays the same or even goes up. So if you have a small garden and you keep it well weeded and you plant your plants with good spacing, as they mature, they will block out weeds, and you will have to weed less and less and less. If you plant a really big garden and you don't get something weeded in time, then the weeds take over and the plant gets stunted, and then the plant can't grow in as well and take care of itself and keep the weeds down itself, and it's constantly sort of fighting that battle with the weeds, and so you wind up pulling more weeds. You wind up spending more time per square foot, and then your plant is less healthy and produces less. So, less is more, especially if you don't have a lot of time or you're brand new. You will feel way more successful if you plant a small area and really intensively take care of it, and then get the productivity from that area. And then next year, you will feel empowered to plant a bigger area and to then know what it takes per square foot per week as far as maintenance. And you can know if it's reasonable or not to add more space. Now, I started off when we moved here with a smaller garden, and it was the best garden I had had up to that point in my life. And even though I had a baby and I had 2 young kids, I think they were 4 and 6. No, that's not right. 5 and 6. Even though I had 2 young kids and a baby, we were still able to keep up with the weeding. And we planted it in a spot that wasn't great dirt, got lots of sunlight, and we took care of it really well. And I was really happy with what we got out of the garden. We had some issues, like every one of my vine crops got taken over by squash beetles, and so we got no cucumbers, no pumpkins, no squash. What was the other things? No pumpkins, no squash, no cucumbers, no watermelon. All of my vine crops were destroyed. But we had great tomatoes. We had really good green beans. We had spinach. We had beets. We had all kinds of other things. And that garden was not overwhelming. The next year we moved spots and we put it in much better dirt. And so things grew really well, and I doubled the size of the garden. And now my baby was 1 and my kids were 6 and 7 and able to help out a little bit more. And we still managed to stay on top of the garden. The next year I doubled it again. And so then I had about 2,000 square feet. And that was the first year that we were really struggling to keep up with it. Then last year, I foolishly was like, oh, it'll be fine. My little one is 4. The big kids are real help, which they are. I'm going to make it even bigger. And then we had a lot of other things going on in the spring and the summer, and it got much harder to keep up with it. And I wished I had gone back and had the smaller garden. We would have gotten more productivity with less work and less stress and less guilt that we had neglected the garden. So the moral of this story is that if you want gardening to be enjoyable and you want it to be rewarding and you want it to be worth your time, having it small enough to take care of is way more important than having it bigger. I have had people that I know whose logic is that they'll plant a really big garden and they'll do some work to take care of it, but by the middle of the summer it's overgrown with weeds, and then they just sort of pick through what outcompeted the weeds and harvest what they can, and that's their philosophy all the time. And so for them, they want to plant more space because they want to not have to take care of it and still have something come out from it. But if you planted a tenth of the space and really spent the same amount of hours working on it, they would get more productivity out of the garden. So I think that's an error I see a lot of people make, is just planting too much at a time, especially when you very first start out, or in my case, the second, third, fourth year, I think are the roughest years for trying to expand and then maybe not being able to keep up with it. So I'm retracting some of that. I would like to be more intentional, more intensive, spend the same amount of work that we spent last year, but have a better kept garden and have more productivity out of it. So that's my goal for this year. Along with that, I want to recommend a book I've had for years, and it applies really well to vegetable gardening, but it also applies if you're trying to grow flowers, or you're just new to gardening in general, it's called Square Foot Gardening. It's by a guy named Mel Bartholomew. And he's got a couple of editions. As far as I know, the older editions are just as good as the new editions. I think that there's some new illustrations and some editing and stuff, but you will get the core of the information even from an older edition. So if you want to get it on thrift books or used on Amazon, or if you see it at a thrift store or something, or you can buy it on Amazon. They've even got some companion planting books that are like go with it now, so that's great. But he goes through the concept of really looking at your garden 1 square foot at a time, how to plant the plants the correct distance apart, how to take care of them, how to keep up with weeding and watering, and he does it on a 1 foot by 1 foot analysis, so you know how much to invest. If you figure out how long does 1 square foot take a week, let's say it takes 5 or 10 minutes a week, and you plant 16 square feet, then you're going to have anywhere between 80 minutes and 160 minutes. But if it takes less than that, then 2 minutes a week, and you plant 16 of them, then you're talking about just over half an hour's worth of work every week to take care of it. So depending on how you garden, how well you take care of it, or how mobile you are, how long things take you, you can really make a good judgment call about this is how much time I have to invest. So this is how much area I'm going to plant. And it does kind of depend on what kinds of plants you put in your garden, but and how much you want to replant. It's called succession planting, where you plant something, it grows, you harvest it, and then you plant something else immediately in its place. This book gives you a great outline for how to do that, how to take care of the weeding, how to take care of the cultivating, how to take care of the fertilizing. If you're dealing with a smaller area, it's easier to keep up on making sure you have the proper fertility in your spot. So I think that book is super helpful, and I have read it several times. I've given a couple copies away to friends, and I've recommended it in person to lots of people many times. So I think it's a great one if you don't have any gardening experience to get that book. Another topic is that sometimes we tend to make things more difficult than they have to be because we're trying to do it the right way. And the biggest place that I see this is in weeding. And of course, weeding is the largest task that you have in the garden, and usually the least fun task. I love to plant. I love to water. I kind of like harvesting. I know a lot of people who love to harvest. That's actually my least favorite part. But most people I know hate weeding. Now, I kind of like weeding, and I shoot myself in the foot a little bit because I like weeding, and so then I will sometimes bite off more weeding than I really have time for because it is very time intensive to pull weeds. So, there are several methods to reduce your amount of weeding. One of them is to plant your plants in an intensive style, and that means wide rows. So instead of planting one little row of beets and then having to weed the pathways between that row of beets and your next row of peppers, you have to weed all this space to have 2 skinny little rows. You can plant a row that's 2, 3, 4 feet wide, depending on how long your arms are and how comfortable you have it reaching into a wide bed. But you would plant a beet, and then 3 inches over you plant a beet, and 3 inches over plant a beet, until you've got 3 feet wide, or more or less. And then you would also plant them this way, so you're planting in a grid shape, or an offset grid. Most places that are doing intensive farming for sale at farmer's market, or farm to table, or selling at the local natural food store are planting this way, because that way you're weeding a walkway and 3 feet wide of actual plants, and then a walkway and 3 feet wide, and they are getting so much more productivity with so much less weeding. Plus, when you plant intensively, the vegetables are going to be able to outcompete the weeds much better. Usually you only have to weed them 2 or 3 times during the summer, and then the rest of the time that area is going to keep itself clear enough of weeds that you don't have to weed it again. It's true even with bigger plants, like cabbage and broccoli. If you plant them the appropriate spacing apart, even though it's much farther apart, like a cabbage needs to be planted 4 feet away from other cabbage plants, because cabbage plants are huge. But if you do that and you take care of that area and then you plant the other cabbages far enough away and close enough, they're going to have just enough overlap that you're really going to have very little weeding in between. And you can still plant broccoli plants, which are larger than beets but smaller than cabbages. You can plant rows that are 2 or 3 broccoli plants wide, and then do the row longer this way. That way you're still doing less weeding of pathways, because pathways eat up a lot of space and require a lot of weeding, and of course don't produce anything. They're just there so that you're not standing on your plants. So, planting intensively is a great way to cut down on weeds. Watering appropriately cuts down on weeds. So once your garden gets established in the spring, you can actually weed your garden really, really well once a week, or medium twice a week. You certainly do not have to water it every day. The more frequently you water, the more likely it is that you are going to germinate weed seeds. And I have seen this hold true in our garden. I will weed and wait, and the plants will be fine, so I don't water them. And then as soon as I water, 2 or 3 days later, we've got little baby weeds everywhere, and I got to start over with the weeding. So if you water them every day, you are getting little weeds germinating all the time, and that's going to take longer to weed. It's not a huge one, but it does help. It helps the health of the plants, and it helps with cutting down a little bit on the weeds. The third thing about trying to help you be more efficient in the garden as far as weeds is mulching. Now, mulching is getting much more popular, and I'm really happy about that. But I grew up in an area in which it was kind of sacrilegious to mulch your vegetable garden. You either took good care of your vegetable garden and it was clear black dirt in between all of your plants, or you didn't take care of it and it was weeds. But you can use all kinds of different things to mulch. You can use plastic landscaping fabric, you can use paper bags, you can use grass clippings, which worked really, really well when I was a kid. If you have access to that, you can use wood chips. There are so many things you can use. You can use hay. I had this hilarious book that I read a year and a half ago from Ruth Stout. It's Ruth Stout's No Work Gardening Method. And it's not no work. It's a dramatic decrease in work, because what she does is she mulches her entire garden in inches of hay. Hay works great. Straw works well. Grass clippings work well. I know quite a few YouTube personalities who use wood chip mulch, and it has multiple benefits. It holds the moisture in, it cuts the weeds down, it keeps your soil from getting so compacted, it provides a microclimate for different fungus and bugs and things that are actually helpful, especially if you have a no-till garden where you're not tilling it up every year and you're just replanting in. It can actually harbor a nice little environment for all of the things that are keeping your garden healthy. So mulching is a great idea, even if you have a little small garden. Even if you have like a little 4x4 foot square in your backyard, mulching is fabulous. So, that's my advice for today. That's the end of my advice for today. Grow things you like. Don't make your garden too big starting off. And find ways to make the labor more efficient by mulching or planting at appropriate spacings. And I think with that, a lot of people who are starting off are going to have a much easier time being successful and then being able to enjoy all of the productivity that they get from their garden. And even if you're somebody who's been gardening for a lot of years, sometimes it's nice just to hear that it's okay to cut back, or it's okay to spend some time and money on mulching to save you time and money in the future. My goal this year is to get my whole garden mulched with wood chips. The power companies around here do the pruning for the power lines. And like even on our property, we have a whole bunch of trees on one side that are right along the power line route. So they have to come and trim them, and then they chip it all into their big dump truck, and then they have to find somewhere to dump it. If they dump it at the landfill, it costs them money to pay the landfill to dump it there. So they have a list you can call, get on, and you can check with your power company in your area. And it kind of depends on the agriculture in your area. If you're worried about bugs, being in the wood chips, or if you're worried about overspray from crops, those are things to keep in mind. I'm not worried about any bug or sprays in our area, so it's going to work fine for me. But they will put you on the list, and then when they have a full load and they're in your area, they will just call you and drop it off at your house, the whole load. So I'm looking forward to doing that and mulching my whole garden. I don't have as much time this year because we've got a whole bunch of projects going on that are going to take a lot more of my time than I've had other springs. But I'm hoping to share some of my gardening adventures. As you can see, I like to knit, and we have sheep, so I'm hoping to share some fiber adventures. I like to sew and quilt, and so I'm going to share some of that. I like to cook and make things from scratch. I'd like to share some of that. We have chickens and guineas and sheep and goats. I'm trying to get some alpacas. I don't know how many years it's going to take to talk my husband into some pigs, but we are just a kind of let's do a little bit of everything farm. And so I have learned a lot about taking care of sheep over the 4.5 years that we've lived here. I grew up with sheep, sort of. We had sheep when I was really little, and I remember bottle feeding and watching them shear and being in the barns during lambing season, but we got rid of them when I was about 6 or 7, and I always wanted to have sheep back because I adore sheep. So we have a small flock, and then we've got one nanny goat who's supposed to have babies any day here, and I'm hoping to have a milking goat. I also like to experiment with lots of other things, like making my own dye for yarn and fiber. I've tried to learn some cheese making, which I'm not particularly good at, but that's a whole avenue of things I would like to explore. We are putting in a root cellar this year, and so I'm looking forward to figuring out how to coordinate my root cellar. We're going to have an expanded pantry, so I'd like to figure out how to do some more food preservation with the root cellar and canning and dehydrating and all of that stuff. So if that sounds like something you're interested in chatting about, listening to somebody chat about, I don't intend for most of these to be just me sitting here chatting. I would love to get some footage of all of the things that we are working on, the projects and the plants and that sort of thing. But today this is what I had time for. So I also like to knit, and I like to crochet, and I like to make patterns. I do follow a lot of designers' patterns, but I have worked on designing my own and figuring out how all of that works. And so that's something that I'm really excited to share, is either patterns that I have made or tell you how to make some of your own patterns for different things. A lot of times I'll see a pattern that I really like, but it's just not exactly what I'm looking for. Like maybe the pattern's great, but it's a raglan instead of a yoke sweater, and I personally really struggle with raglans. My knitting is very flat and very wide. My stitches are very flat and very wide, and when I make a raglan, it never turns out correctly. So I need to rewrite every raglan pattern that I attempt by doing a swatch and then doing all the math to make it come out. So this is a yoke sweater. I think this is it's Zweig, Caitlin Hunter's Zweig, and then the blue brick made this beautiful color changing yarn. And I'm working on Andrea Mowry's Everyday shawl. Ooh, you can see the pattern much better in this lighting. I'm sorry, my phone camera is like tripping out with the sunlight in the window. It's not ideal. My apologies for that. Also, I'm not a monogamous knitter, so I knit lots of things at the same time. It's kind of unlikely that you'll see me working on the same project back to back, because I'm always switching between things. So, anyway, this is supposed to be all kinds of things. And I don't know if the YouTube algorithm is going to love that or hate that. The reviews I'm getting from other people is the algorithm is going to hate that I like to do lots of different things. So hopefully I'm going to attract an audience of people who are interested in lots of different topics. One of the things that I'm really getting into this year is foraging, not just for food, because we do that. We have a wild asparagus that grows in the ditch, and so we forage for that, and we forage for elderberries, and we forage for chokecherries. And my daughter likes to pick the weeds that she knows are edible. So like poor man's spinach and purslane, she will sometimes in the summertime bring them in and we'll eat them for lunch. But also looking at things like burdock root and stinging nettles, which we have that it grows wild here. On top of foraging for food, I'm trying to get into foraging for dye plants so that I can dye my yarn. We have sheep and we make yarn from their wool, and I would love to be able to do some colors because we have Icelandic sheep and they come in gray and brown and black and white and tan and all kinds of different colors. So we get yarn in different colors, but we haven't looked into dyeing it at all, and I would like to be able to forage for dye. And one of the things that you can do after you've dyed something is that you can actually take your leftover dye pot, and it's called laking. I don't know much about it besides what it's called, but you basically get the rest of the pigment out of the dye pot, and then you save that for making paint. And I think my kids would be really super interested in that. Making our own homemade paint from the leftover dye. So, anyway, I am really excited. I am really excited to share lots of different things. So, hopefully, if you're still here at this point in the video, you give me a like. You can subscribe, leave a comment. All of those things helps my video get shown to more people. And even if you're only interested in some of those topics, I will try when I put out a new video to kind of put the main theme of what it's about. So this one's going to be gardening, but if I've got ones that are more craft-based, or if they're more animal husbandry or foraging or dyeing or whatever, I'll put that in the title so that, one, it's easier to find, and two, if you're subscribed and you're not really interested in cheese making but you're interested in 5 of the other things, you'll know right away that maybe you don't want to watch the cheese making video, but you'll watch next time when it's a dye video. Also, my oldest daughter is 11, and she knits, and she is quite crafty, and she is very excited to join me sometimes on the podcast. So we're going to get that kind of coordinated. I think she's a little bit more interested in like cooking and then the sewing and knitting area than gardening. I think she's less interested in gardening. And then some of the other, like she's not interested in cheese making, but she likes to make cookies, and she likes to plant flowers, and she likes to knit. So hopefully she'll join me sometimes. Anyway, I hope you guys have a great day doing whatever it is you're doing, and that you feel inspired and encouraged to grow your first garden or to make some adjustments so that your gardening experience is easier and more enjoyable and more productive.